Welcome to lecture number 8. In this lecture, we are going to focus on the events of 1948, 1949. Let's have a look at the main events that we discussed in the last couple of weeks. We'd like to start with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was a turning point in the relations between the Jewish minority in Palestine and the Arab majority, and what's going to happen with the Zionist project that now is going to be backed by the British rulers of Palestine after World War One. Another important point is the introduction of the Balfour Declaration, that is the concept of Jewish national home policy, into the Mandate Charter that was issued by the victorious powers after the war and adopted by the new League of Nations, which put the Palestinians under what can be called the triple bind, that is the need to be confronting the Zionist settler colonial project on the ground, the British administration supporting it, and now also the international support for the Zionist project by the international community via the Mandate Charter and the League of Nations. So, to put it very briefly, during the years of the mandate, that is from early 1920s to 1948, the British administration was paramount in the development of the Yishuv, its society, economy, industries, and political apparatus. And as a result of this support that the British administration gave to the Yishuv, the Arabs, their economy and their society were being repressed. And another outcome of this policy was the increasing segregation between Arabs and Jews. The Arabs of Palestine did revolt, certainly during the years of 1936 to 1939, what was called the Great Arab Revolt. There were other forms of resistance that we discussed. And eventually in 36, as a result of the Arab Revolt, the British established the POL Commission of Inquiry, which eventually, few months afterwards, suggested for the first time in the history of Palestine the idea of partition. You have the map on the right. This was the original plan that the POL Commission recommended to the British government. Their working assumption was that the mandate is no more workable and some other political model should be adopted, and the model they recommended was partition into an Arab state, a Jewish state, and a sort of international area that will be controlled by the British. It was in fact this recommendation that sparked the armed revolt by the Palestinians that was eventually crushed by British repression in 1939. In that year, the British made an attempt to reach a sort of agreement or at least conversation between the sides, and they organized in February the London Conference. As a result of the conference, a new white paper was issued by the government. This time, the white paper was reversing in many senses the original Balfour policy of supporting the establishment of a Jewish state. As a response to this white paper, the leadership of the Yishuv launched a rebellion against the British administration, which included organizing illegal immigration that was restricted, severely restricted by this last white paper. They should also organize clandestine takeovers of land and building of settlement. And there were also acts of terrorism against British forces in Palestine. Let's have a look at the demographics in Palestine, approximate numbers. If we focus on the years that we have been covering, that is from the 1880s with the emergence of Zionism and the first waves of immigration into Palestine, you can see that the Jewish community in Palestine was always a very small minority. Um, when you look at these numbers, you can understand the frustration of the indigenous people of Palestine. First, to the issuing of the Balfour Declaration that was all about giving Palestine for the constitution of a Jewish state. And you can understand the frustration in 1937 when the Peel Commission was recommending to partition the country and to give part of it to a small minority of people. So when you try to understand the various stages and waves of resistance that was mounted by the Arab Palestinians during all this period, you just need to remember these numbers, these demographics, and juxtapose these numbers with what we already know about the support that the Zionist project was given, first by the Balfour Declaration and the British administration, and also by the international community via the League of Nations and the support that the Mandate Charter gave to the development of a Jewish national home in Palestine. As we approximate to the years that we will be discussing this week, you can see that in 1947, the Jewish community was about 33%, whereas the Arabs were still the solid majority. We need to keep in mind these numbers when we will be discussing in a few minutes the tragic events of 1948. And we will have again a look at the demographics after 1948. If the Jewish community so far, the increase in their demographics was thanks to generous policies of immigration support by the British, that is mainly by immigration. The changes in the demographics after 1948 will be based on a very different series of events. Let's start from looking into the village files. The knowledge about the village files and what this project was about is needed to understand a bit better how things unfolded during the tragic events of 1948. So the village files was a Zionist initiative that its main aim was to charter the Arab villages of Palestine and also some of the mixed neighborhoods in the cities. It was first suggested in 1940 to the Jewish National Fund, and it was finally adopted by the leadership of the Yishuv and executed during the decade of the 40 by forces from within the Haganah. So these people collected information about the Arab towns. They charted the topographic location, access roads, a variety of other characteristics, and also patterns, social patterns within the villages in terms of socio-political composition, leadership, and also people who were armed. And in addition, this collection of intelligence included forming a sort of index of hostility of people within the Arab villages to characterize those who were active during the Great Arab Revolt and other activists against the Zionist project. Um, the general idea of the village files was to have enough information about the Arab villages and the Arab neighborhood um, and prepare the Agana forces and the Yishuv itself for a future takeover of the country. Um, the project included also two other things, um, included creating special units of what can be called Arabist Jewish soldiers. Um, the Agana used Sephardim and Mizrahi Jews that master Arabic, and in their eyes they look like Arabs, and they use these people to infiltrate them within the Arab towns in order to collect information. Another thing that was included in this project was creating a network of Arab collaborators from within the Arab society to help the Agana collecting the information. Um, there were many files charting the rural and urban areas, mainly the rural areas of Palestine, and this information was used during 1948 that we are going to discuss in a few minutes from now. Um, those files, most of them have been lost, and only few remain in some of the Israeli archives today. Now, I'm asking you at this point to read the article that you have a link for here that explains a bit more about the village files and the purposes and the usages of these files in 1948, 1949. If you are watching the YouTube version of this lecture, so please go into the PowerPoint version so you can click into the link to read this article. What happened in Palestine during World War II and some main developments, particularly in 1945. Now, in contrast to World War I, Palestine was not a war zone during World War II, but it was mainly a logistics center of activities run by the British, later in collaboration with the Americans. Um, as it is well known, during this year, the terrible events of the Holocaust were sweeping the continent. 6 million Jews were murdered during these years by the Nazi regime. Towards the end of the war, the leadership of the Yishuv have realized that at some point the British will be evacuating Palestine, and this was mainly based on the conclusions from the years of the Peel Commission and afterwards, when the British have already started floating ideas of partition and leaving the country. Towards the end of the war in 43, the French mandate in Syria and Lebanon ended, and these two countries emerged as independent states. With the end of the war, um, Labour government is formed in the UK, and in the US, Harry Truman replaced Franklin Roosevelt that have just died. On March 1945, the Arab League was created in Cairo. The Arab League was an institution formed by initially six Arab state members: Egypt, Iraq, Transjordan, later named Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. Later, a few weeks later, Yemen joined the Arab League. Um, Currently, the Arab League has 22 members. Um, Initially, the Arab League was a regional organization of Arab states that was formed to focus on regional cooperation and development. But the first major action of the Arab League was, in fact, the joint intervention of some of the states that formed the Arab League um, during 1948 um, in a war with the just newly formed state of Israel. This intervention, as we will see later, was made allegedly on behalf of the majority of the Arab population of Palestine that have been just uprooted. We will discuss this in few moments. On November the same year, another important development occurred in Palestine. Um, a new Arab Higher Committee was established. Remember that the former one was established in 36 during the first days of the Arab strike that led to the Arab revolt, and that Arab Higher Committee was never recognized by the British government as representative of the Arab population. This time, the mandate government recognized the Arab Higher Committee early in 46, and the Arab Higher Committee will be, during this time, the um, lawful representative of the Arab Palestinian community. On the 13th of November 1945, uh, just we can say in a few weeks after the closing of the war, um, the Foreign Secretary of Britain, Ernest Bevin, released a very important declaration on Palestine. In the declaration, he basically canvassed the problem of Palestine and the management of the British government of Palestine in relation to what he defined as the dual obligation, on the one hand, to the Jews according to the Balfour Declaration, but on the other hand, to the Arabs. And he claimed that the lack of a clear definition of policy have been one main cause of all the troubles that the country have been experiencing. Now, in the declaration, Bevin also refers at length to um, the plight of the victims of Nazi persecution, particularly to the Jewish people, and the problem at that point in time of hundreds of thousands of Jews looking for a place to where to immigrate. Palestine certainly was one such place, and the leadership of the Yishuv was um, pressuring on the British government to release some form of new policy that will unrestrict Jewish immigration into Palestine. So the declaration talks about this issue, and eventually the British government will indeed change the quotas for Jewish immigration into Palestine. In addition to the parts of declaration referring to Jewish immigration and referring to the problems that Palestine have been experiencing during the last 25 years, the declaration also um, decide to establish a new commission of inquiry, this time together with the United States. At this point in time, we need to realize that there is a new world power, the United States of America, and at this point, nothing can be done without the intervention of the Americans. Um, so Bevin in this declaration invites for the establishment of a joint Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, and the terms of reference for this committee, I will now read them. First, to examine political, economic, and social conditions in Palestine as they bear upon the problem of Jewish immigration and settlement therein and the well-being of the peoples now living therein. Secondly, to examine the position of the Jews in those countries in Europe where they have been the victims of Nazi and fascist persecution. Third, to hear the views of competent witnesses and to consult representative Arabs and Jews on the problems of Palestine, and to make recommendation to His Majesty's government and the government of the United States for the interim handling of these problems, as well as for their permanent solution. So they were looking this time for a permanent solution. And fourth, to make such other recommendation to His Majesty's government and the government of the United States, etc. And the Commission will prepare a permanent solution for submission to the United Nations. So at this point, we don't have any more the League of Nations. As we said in the previous slide, the United Nations was established in 1945. As part of this change of heart that was heavily influenced by the tragic event of the Jewish Holocaust during World War II, the British government did change the immigration quotas for Jewish refugees. What were the reactions to the Bevin Declaration? Well, you can probably guess that the Jewish leadership of the issue did support the declaration, as it was calling for reconsideration of Jewish immigration into Palestine compared to the restrictions that were imposed in the White Paper before the war, 1939. Now, on the Arab side, there were two major responses, one by the Palestinian Arab High Committee that was established right after the war and was recognized by the British authorities. In a letter from the Arab Higher Committee to the British government, the committee reiterated that the British government should remain faithful to the restrictions on immigration in the White Paper of 1939, and in general rejected the Bevin Declaration, claiming that there have been enough commissions of inquiry about Palestine, and the British government must take into account that any Jewish immigration its purpose is to create a Jewish majority in Palestine in order to appropriate Palestine and make it into a Jewish state. So basically, the Arab Higher Committee opposed the Bevin Declaration. The second Arab response to the Bevin Declaration was given by the Arab League, that was also formed right after the war. And in a letter on December 1945, the Arab League writes extensively to the British government, also rejecting the main principles laid in the Bevin Declaration. Now, the points made by the Arab League are really interesting and worth reading them. We have here a brief quotation from the letter. By the way, you have in our Moodle site, in this week folder, few pages from a book which discusses the Arab responses to the Bevin Declaration. I suggest you to have a look at them. So what the Arab League said. First of all, the Arab League appreciates the distinction that the declaration made between the Jewish question that derived from World War II, that is the tragic situation of the Jewish people in Europe following the Holocaust, and on the other hand, the Zionist question that refers to Palestine on issues of immigration and land. In the second point, the Arab League makes clear that if Zionism were to achieve its aim, the Arabs of Palestine, would be deprived of their homeland, of their national rights and their democratic principle, which gives them the right of self-determination in the land which they inherited from their fathers from time immemorial. So the Arab League is making here clear that the Arabs of Palestine are the indigenous people of the land and their right and sovereignty must be respected. Then the Arab League says events in Palestine during the 27 years that followed the Balfour Declaration, that is all the time that the British rule over Palestine, have proved that persecution cannot be cured by persecution, implying that the support of the British government for the Zionist project in Palestine led to the persecution of the Arabs of Palestine. In the next point, the letter says the dispute between Arabs and Zionists, and this is interesting because the Arab League uses Zionists and not Jews. Let's keep reading this point and it explains better. So again, the dispute between Arabs and Zionists may well lead to one between Arabs and Jews, a thing unknown to Arabs and Muslims who throughout history have been the most tolerant of Jews. We have discussed this extensively in the first week of the subject, the way the Jewish communities live across the caliphates in the past and later in the Ottoman Empire, in Arab societies, and particularly in Palestine, what we define as shared life, even if it wasn't a perfect harmony between Arabs and Jews. When you compare that to the experiences of the Jewish Ashkenazi people who lived in Europe and the persecutions that they suffer, with its highest point, obviously, during the Jewish Holocaust in World War II. So you can understand why the Arab League presses home here in this point, and with a distinction between Zionist and Jewish people more generally. In the next point, the letter says the Committee of the Arab League cannot see in your statement a justification for the demand for fresh immigration, Jewish immigration, into Palestine, other than that the demand is the result of Zionist diplomatic pressure in Great Britain and another friendly country. So again, they disconnect between the needs of Jewish refugees um, in Europe looking for a place to live after the Holocaust, and on the other hand, the problem of Jewish immigration in Palestine. This is a very important response, as well as it was the response from the Arab Higher Committee, and I believe it explains quite clearly the different disputes between the Arab leadership in Palestine and the Arab leadership in the Arab world and the Zionist case. So, following the instructions in the Bevin Declaration, an Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry was established in 1946. The commission was put together that year in January. Very quickly, uh, a couple of months afterwards, the commission arrived into Palestine and began its interrogations. You can see here in the photo one of the sessions in which the Zionist representatives are given testimony. Here you see David Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of the Yishuv and will become the first prime minister of the State of Israel in 1948. In April, a month after the inquiry, a report was submitted by the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry. What were the recommendations of the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry? These were really very interesting, and mainly 4 points. The first point referred to Jewish immigration of displaced Jews in Europe due to the Holocaust, and the Commission says that Palestine should open its doors for 100,000 Jews. The second point, surprisingly interesting, the Commission says that Palestine should be neither a Jewish or an Arab state, so it doesn't state a position in favor of the Zionists. The third point says that the British mandate, should continue until the question of Palestine is transferred to the United Nations. And this is actually what's going to happen in the coming months. And the fourth point, in favor for the Zionists, it calls for the cancellation on any restrictions on land sales to the Jews. Now, following the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry, another committee was established to propose a more specific plan based on the Anglo-American Inquiry. This committee was called the Morrison, issued what was called a Morrison-Grady plan. And the most important point in the plan was that it recommended a unitary federal trusteeship in Palestine under British control. So again, it reiterated the commitment not to establish a Jewish or a totally Arab state. What were the reactions of the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine to the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry and to the Morrison-Grady plan? Well, the Jewish leadership in the Yishuv rejected anything that was not based on the idea of partition, and this was, as you can imagine, simply because partition was the only option, the only configuration that would enable the establishment of an independent Jewish state in Palestine, even if this was to be established only on part of Palestine. On the other hand, the Arab leadership, the only formula they were willing to accept, obviously, also was the idea of the unitary state, not partition, since in a unitary state, maintaining Palestine as geopolitical unit meant that the Arab population in Palestine will remain the majority and therefore able to influence the constitution and running of whatever political institutions will be established in such a new state. As a result of these discrepancies and the desire on the side of the British government to leave Palestine. In February 47, the British government announced that they are taking the question of Palestine to the United Nations. In May, the United Nations formed a special committee, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, the UNSCOP, and they were mandated to prepare a report on final recommendations for Palestine. For 3 months that year, the Commission was surveying the situation in Palestine, and in August 1947, a majority report was submitted. So the majority report, as said, was put to a vote as a resolution for the UN General Assembly. This was resolution number 181, and the vote took place on 29 of November 1947. The main points in the resolution were: A, to terminate the British mandate no later than 1st of August in 48, to create two independent states, one Arab, one Jewish, to create a special regime, international regime for Jerusalem, to create economic union between the two independent states, and the resolution called the new states to protect religious and minority rights. Now, the resolution was approved. 33 countries, states voted in favor. The minority report that was submitted did not suggested partition, but rather, following the previous commissions of inquiry, suggested to create a unitary federal state in Palestine made up of Jewish and Arab cantons. But as said, this was the minority report and was not put to a vote. Now, when we look at the map of the partition plan for Palestine, the brown area is the Arab new state that the resolution talked about, and the blue area, the Jewish state. Looking into the numbers in terms of territories, the resolution in fact gave to the Jewish state 56% of the land, and to the Arab state 42% of the land. Now, remember that still at this point in time, the Arabs in Palestine are the majority. Nevertheless, they were given the smaller territory. In terms of demographics, when we calculate the population distribution in the two states that were supposed to be established, in the Arab state, there was supposed to be a majority of about 800,000 Arabs and a small minority of 10,000 Jews, whereas in the Jewish state you can see that the populations were more or less the same, about 500,000 people each, which when you put all together again, you can clearly see that in the whole of Palestine, the Arab population was the majority. So as said, this resolution was put to a vote and the resolution passed. In the next slide, there is a few second documentary where we hear and see the voting at the UN General Assembly, and then also a very brief interview with the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, where he states that from his point of view, the State of Israel was not established based on this resolution, on the Resolution 181, but from his point of view, the State of Israel was established following the victory of the Israeli army in 1948, 1949, which we still need to discuss. Now, you can't see this short documentary in the YouTube version of this lecture. So if you would like to watch it, go to the PowerPoint version and you can just click on the image and you will be able to see. Now, the next question is obviously what happened on the ground in relation to this resolution, how the partition plan approved in the United Nations was received by the Arab leadership and the Jewish leadership in Palestine.
Resolution of the Dutch Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstained.
Wakati bato yo amdina ngota kumbeko hakutatu bitokumrat beko hakoa hayudi shona khmitabien.
The Arab leadership in Palestine rejected the UN resolution to partition the country. Also did the Arab League. Now, we need to remember the Balfour Declaration was made without any sort of consultation with the Arabs of Palestine. The Mandate Charter was written incorporating the Balfour Declaration, supporting the idea of a Jewish state, in spite of the Arab protests, as it was as well the support given by the League of Nations. And now the Arabs were facing a resolution, an international resolution, that is going to petition a country in which they have lived for millennia and there are the majority, given in fact the most part of the land in the resolution to the Jewish state. For the very same reasons, but seeing from the Zionist viewpoint, the Jewish leadership accepted the UN partition plan because for them this was the opportunity they were creating for about 50 years to have a sovereign Jewish state in Palestine. As we will see, in their eyes, this was only the first step. As a result, civil war between Arabs and Jews broke out immediately in Palestine, and the British, instead of waiting to the 1st of August, as it was said in the UN resolution, they announced that the British government will end its mandate in Palestine on May the 14th. This was the situation during the first weeks after the UN resolution, and what is going to happen at this point and for about a year or more will change tragically and drastically the state of affairs in Palestine. This is the Red House. The Red House was a typical early Tel Avivian building. In this building, on a cold Wednesday afternoon, 10 of March 1948, a group of 11 men, veteran Zionist leaders, together with young military Jewish officers, put the final touches to a plan for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That same evening, military orders were dispatched to the units on the ground to prepare for the systematic expulsion of the Palestinians from vast areas of the country. The orders came with a detailed description of the methods to be employed to forcibly evict the people: large-scale intimidation, laying siege to and bombarding villages and population centers, setting fire to homes, properties, and woods, expulsion, demolition, and finally, planting mines among the rubble to prevent any of the expelled inhabitants from returning. Each unit was issued with its own list of villages and neighborhoods as the target of this master plan. Codename Plan D, or Dalet in Hebrew, this was the fourth and final version of less substantial plans that outlined the fate the Zionists had in store for Palestine and consequently for its native population. The previous three schemes had articulated only obscurely how the Zionist leadership contemplated dealing with the presence of so many Palestinians living in the land the Jewish national movement coveted as its own. This fourth and last blueprint spelled it out clearly and unambiguously. The Palestinians had to go. The aim of the plan was in fact the destruction of both the rural and urban areas of Palestine. End of quote. This is a quote from Ilan Pappet's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and it tells the story of this building, as you just heard, and about the preparations towards the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. This is the event I was referring to that will drastically change things in Palestine. The expulsion of the Palestinians from the land and the destruction of their towns, villages, and neighborhoods continued from November 1947, right after Resolution 181 at the United Nations, and until July 1949. On May 48, Israel declares its independence just few hours after the British left the country and a provisional government was established. Just a day after the declaration of independence, and you can see here a very famous photo where David Ben-Gurion is declaring the independence of the new state of Israel. So just one day after this photo was taken, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq invaded Palestine to fight the Israeli forces. But their armies, the military level and equipment of their armies was not fit to beat the Israeli army that was based on the Haganah. And the Haganah was turned into the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, during the war. So on the one hand, the civil war was taking place in Palestine through the expulsion of the Palestinians and the destruction of their homes, towns, and villages. And from May, a conventional war was taking place between Israel and the armies of the Arab countries of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. That conventional war continued until January 49, when Israel defeated all those Arab armies and armistice agreements were signed between Israel and the Arab countries. The Palestinians have defined the tragic event of the ethnic cleansing of the people as the Nakba, which in Arabic means disaster or catastrophe. During the Nakba, almost 800,000 Palestinians were expelled from the land, from their towns, villages, and neighborhoods in the cities. About 600 towns and villages and neighborhoods were destroyed by Israeli forces once people were expelled. You have here in this table the process from November 47 to July 49, the different stages through which Arab Palestinians were expelled from their homes, the number of destroyed localities, and the approximate number of Palestinian refugees that were created. So this is perhaps the right moment to say, when you hear about the Palestinian refugee problem, and if you ask yourself before where these people came from, why there are Palestinian refugees, so the answer is the Nakba. So the answer is the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people by Jewish forces during 47 to 49. That is the event that created people living for centuries in the land. This event created them, make them into refugees. If you remember from the quote I read a couple of slides before from Ilan Pape's book and the story of the Red House, where decisions were made for the final touches of the plan for ethnic cleansing, you remember that the quote mentions few plans before the last plan, Plan D or Plan Dalet, that were elaborated by the Jewish leadership, political and military leadership of the issue. So everything began in already 37 with what was called at the beginning the Elimelech plan, and the basic idea was to have a plan for the potential takeover of Palestine in the event of British withdrawal. This plan continued to be elaborated during the 40s. The Plan C already detailed a number of military practices to be implemented. And what is important also to mention here is that if you remember, we discussed a few slides ago the village files. So the village files were in fact the data that helped the political and military forces to carry out the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The village files provided the necessary data about localities and people in the Arab community that were targeted during the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So this is the Plan D or Plan Dalet, formally adopted on March 10th, 1948, and implemented immediately, though operations of expulsion were taking place already since November 47. This was, as said, the last plan of a series of plans that were being developed during the 40s. That is, and you can also probably read in Nur Masalha book about the idea of transfer, which is perhaps another concept to ethnic cleansing, and how this idea was a central part on the planification of the Shuv for Palestine. So ethnic cleansing was present as a plan among the leadership of the Yishuv, and after the November 47 181 resolution, the partition resolution, and the rejection of the Arab leadership of this resolution in the eyes of the Jewish leadership of the Yishuv, that Arab rejection was used to justify the takeover of the country, as Ben-Gurion claimed the resolution was a dead letter, and the question of the final borders is open to operations on the ground, that is, military operations on the ground. We have here another quote from Ilan Pape's book referring to Plan Dalet. These operations can be carried out in the following manner, either by destroying villages, by setting fire to them, by blowing them up, and by planting mines in their debris, and especially of those population centers which are difficult to control continuously, or by mounting command and control operations according to the following guidelines: encirclement of the villages, conducting a search inside them. In case of resistance, the armed force must be wiped out and the population expelled outside the borders of the state. And this was implemented widely, and as we said before, almost 800,000 Arab Palestinians were expelled, and about 600 towns, villages, and neighborhoods were destroyed by the Israeli forces, just to de-Arabize Palestine. This was the Nakba, the destruction of the Arab space that characterized Palestine for centuries. The dispossession of the Palestinians during 1948-1949 was the most formative event in the modern history of these people, and is still today the most significant component of Palestinian identity. The crime that was carried out during this period of time, the crime of ethnic cleansing, has not been recognized as an independent crime under international law. However, it is used in its broad sense as forcible deportation of a population in the statutes of the International Criminal Court. The most known definitions used for ethnic cleansing are the US State Department definition and Drazen Petrovich definition. Both talked about the removal of people from the land in order to change the demographic balance of that particular territory. And as you can understand already, this is exactly what took place by Jewish forces in 48-49 in Palestine. This is the Nakba map. As you can see, Arab Palestinian localities, towns, villages, and neighborhoods were destroyed all over the country. This was a massive operation that, again, caused the expulsion of almost 800,000 Palestinians and the destruction of about 600 towns, villages, and neighborhoods. most of the Palestinians were expelled into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Others will be expelled to Transjordan, later to become Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and few also to Egypt. Palestinians will later travel all around the world and create new Palestinian communities because of these refugee situations they found themselves. Many of these people were expelled, they were forced to walk out of their houses. Others were transported with trucks, and other people were also transported from the Jaffa port and the Haifa port uh, with boats and ships into Lebanon to the north, and Gaza and Egypt to the south. We will expand about the Palestinian refugees in the next lecture. If Jewish immigration was the only factor that helped the Yishuv to grow from the first days of the first Aliyah and all the way into the late 40s, the Nakba was the factor that radically changed demographics in the country. Within the borders of the newly formed State of Israel, only 150,000 Palestinians remain. This takes into account, obviously, the almost 800,000 Palestinians that were expelled. This means that in the newly formed State of Israel, Arabs were the minority. The other Palestinians, as we said before, were expelled into mainly West Bank and Gaza, but also into the Arab neighboring countries. So after the Nakba, the Zionist movement achieved their dream. They created a Jewish state in Palestine in which the Jews were the majority. For the Palestinians, the change was indeed catastrophic. From being the majority community on the land, after the Nakba, Palestinians became the minority within the State of Israel, and other Palestinians became refugees away from their native land. Ethnic cleansing comes always with economic dispossession of the people who were cleansed from their land. Let us begin with the issue of land and territory. Now, just before the 48 war and the UN resolution of November 47, Jewish land ownership in Palestine amounted just to 6% of mandatory Palestine. Just 6%. That was the amount of land that the JNF and other Zionist land agencies managed to buy from Arab landowners and create on this territory new Jewish settlement. 6%. Now, following the Nakba and the territorial conquest that followed, the State of Israel became in possession of 77% of Palestine, from 6% to 77%, due to the military victory of the new state of Israel and the expulsion of the Palestinians. Now, that 77% was already 22% more than the territory that was approved in the 47 UN resolution of partition. After the war, and until these very days, about 95% of Palestinian-owned land was confiscated by the State of Israel. With the establishment, the official establishment of the State of Israel in May 48, the whole new system of legal formulation and political institutions were set up to legitimize seizing Palestinian property. From the hundreds of thousands of houses, Palestinian houses that were depopulated by Jewish forces in neighborhoods in the big cities of the country, such as Haifa, Yafo, Lydia, and Ramle, houses were given to the Zionist elite back then, both to military officers and to also politicians in the Zionist party that dominated politics at those time, a party called Mapai and led by David Ben-Gurion. So that in terms we have said of land, houses, in addition, field, orchards, vineyards, shops, factories, businesses of all kind that were owned by Palestinians were given to Jewish people, also to the new immigrants coming into the country just during and after the establishment of the state. Property in Palestinian houses was systematically looted, as well as stores of food in Palestinian shops and stores that were given to Jewish settlement. You have a link here to have a look, some reading and documentary on the looting of books, ancient books that were held in Palestinian houses by the elite Palestinian families in the cities. Now, some scholars have tried to estimate the total value of Palestinian land and property that was seized by the State of Israel as a consequence of the Nakba and the 48-49 war, and numbers come close to 1.2 billion sterlings, and that is in 48 prices, not prices of today. Now, all in all, what we can say is that the economic dispossession of the Palestinians in terms of land, housing, businesses, and property, other property, was significant, play a significant role for the new Israeli economy after the state was established. So we need to see the Nakba also in relation to the economic dispossession that it created, and how these native indigenous assets of the Palestinians serve to base the settled colonial economy of the newly formed State of Israel. As the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is still undergoing, the United Nations General Assembly adopts Resolution 194 on December 48, and we have here a quote from Article 11 worth reading. So In this article, the resolution says that the United Nations General Assembly resolves that the refugees, and this is referring to the Palestinian refugees, wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors, should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss or damage to property which, under principles of international law or inequity, should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible, that is, the State of Israel. Instructs the Conciliation Commission to facilitate the repatriation, resettlement, and economic and social rehabilitation of the refugees and the payment of compensation, and to maintain close relations with the Director of the United Nations Relief for Palestine refugees, and through him with the appropriate organs and agencies of the United Nations. This resolution, as you can guess, was never implemented, and the United Nations itself have done very little to bring Israel to accept and implement this resolution to repatriate or compensate Palestinian refugees. But we have this resolution, and it's still an important piece in the history and the political coordinates of this conflict. And also the question of the Palestinian refugees have been always a significant part in all negotiations that have took place between the Palestinians and Israel. Now, as the United Nations discusses the issue of the Palestinian refugees, the new state of Israel and its new government are already adopting a very clear policy towards those refugees. As the Nakba unfolds, the government decides to destroy Palestinian villages and towns from which Palestinians were deported, expelled, and on those lands, in many cases, were used either to build new Jewish settlements or forests. So today, when you tour the state of Israel and you go into beautiful forests to have a picnic on a nice walk in nature, you can easily find in many of these places remains of those destroyed Palestinian towns and villages. Looting and dispossession need to be seen as part of what is called the anti-repatriation policy. So there was here a very clear attitude on the side of Israel not to allow, in any case, the repatriation, the return of the Palestinian refugees. We will discuss this more in detail next lecture, but the right of return will become, together with the memory of the Nakba, one of the most significant components in Palestinian identity and Palestinian politics. Now, as Israel destroys the villages and hides its remains, builds new settlements, and continues the looting and dispossession, diplomatic action is taken in collaboration, particularly with the United States, to try and prevent the international pressure that the United Nations was somehow creating in order to bring about the return of the Palestinian refugees. In addition to all this, from a military point of view, the new borders of Israel were taken as threshold through which no Palestinian refugee could ever cross. So people, Palestinians who tried to cross back into their towns and villages, either to try and collect their belongings or to tender their fields, were shot to death. So this altogether represented Israel's anti-repatriation policy that was shaped and implemented during the last stages of the Nakba and afterwards. You have here on this slide a list of the most important events that took place during the period of time that we discuss in this lecture, from early 47 all the way to approximately mid 49. So this list can also help you going through the slides on the most important parts of this lecture. In the next three slides, we are going to have three different activities in order to help you consolidate in the knowledge that we have been building during this week lecture. Let me start by introducing an Israeli NGO called Zochrot, which means remembering. Zochrot main activity is about to bring the memory of the Nakba to the Israeli population. After the Nakba occurred, Israeli society never dealt with this event. Only during the late 1980s, the history of the Nakba and the factual events of the Nakba were brought to the Israeli public by means of new historical writing and new civil society organizations that asked to deal with these, to ask questions about that period of time in the formation of the State of Israel. So Zochrot, as an NGO, works doing a series of different activities in this area. And one of these activities is to take Israelis and international visitors to Israel to destroyed Palestinian villages, to show them where particular towns or villages existed, what were the characteristics, the social patterns of that particular place, and how it was destroyed by Israeli forces during 48-49. So I'm asking you to go back to the PowerPoint presentation version of this lecture, to click on the image, or you have a link below the image, and watch this short tour into one of the villages that was destroyed in 48. In this case is Hirbat al-Umur, Al-Quds, in Al-Quds district, in Jerusalem district. There are also other tours there that were documented. You may feel free to look into them as well. You will see that the guide is generally a Palestinian whose ancestor lived in the place or close to the place and is somehow related. Some of these guides work for the NGO Zochrot, others volunteer to escort and guide the tours into the Palestinian destroyed villages. These tours continue to take place also today. And yes, Israelis do attend these tours, though the number of Israelis who attend the tours and really try to open their curiosity to these events are a very tiny minority within Israeli society. The second activity I'm asking you to engage with is also sponsored by the same NGO Zochrot. Sohrot engaged a few years ago in a project to document the events of the Nakba by way of interviewing former Jewish soldiers that participated in the dispossession of Palestinians in 48, 49. In this link, you will find an interview with Amnon Newman, a Jewish person, an Israeli who was a soldier during the events of the Nakba, and he tells his story and recognizes his participation in the events. There are other interviews that Zuhrot did with other former Israeli soldiers for that time, but I believe that this one will suffice to understand what this activity is trying to do. It is not rare in conflicts of this type to have people on the side of the perpetrator that eventually at some point in time decide to sort of confess or share their views on what they have done years ago. The last activity for this lecture is to watch a 1 hour movie. It's a TV movie called Hirbet Hize. Hirbet Hize is a novel written in 1949, an historical fiction written by Samech Izar, an Israeli writer, and the fiction novel deals with the expulsion of Palestinians from a fictional village called Hirbet Hiza. And in fact, the movie tried to portray, to depict a situation that took place at that time in the country. Many years after the novel was published, the story was made into a TV movie in 1978, and the Israeli television eventually banned it. Only during the last years, the TV movie emerged again, and people in Israel have started to watch it. So please go to the movies folder in Moodle and you will find a link to movies, and there you will see you will be able to watch the movie itself. The novel, sorry, was also translated into English only during the last year. And you have also a link here in the PowerPoint version of the lecture to click on it and go to an article that discuss the novel, the TV movie, and the translation into English. I believe that these three activities together, watching a tour into Palestinian destroyed village led by an Israeli NGO that promotes the memory of the Nakba, and then watching an interview with a Jewish former soldier that took part in the displacement of Palestinians, and lastly, to watch this important TV movie depicting the expulsion of Palestinians from a particular village will form and help you understanding better the messages that were intended to be transmitted in this week lecture.